This is it, your final opportunity to join the 6 Pillars at Sea Marriage Getaway. In April 2025, we're setting sail for our last ever marriage getaway, and we want you there to experience the unforgettable journey to the extraordinary marriage you desire. Don't wait. Spots are extremely limited and they're filling fast. Get all the details now at oneextraordinarymarriage.com/getaway and reserve your place before it's gone.
From Naples, Florida, this is the One Extraordinary Marriage Show, where being busy is overdone, romancing is fun, and scheduling sex has taken the guesswork out of wondering when you're going to get some. I'm Tony DeLorenzo, your co-host, along with my beautiful wife, Elisa. From coast to coast and around the world, thank you for joining us. It's time to talk sex, love, and commitment. Give us a call or text us on the Hug Hotline at 858-876-5663. Or send us an email to hugs@oneextraordinarymarriage.com. In today's episode, we're talking about the journey of forgiveness, how to release the hurt, find peace, and move forward even when apologies are absent and change seems distant.
Marianne Williamson had this to say about forgiveness. She said, "Forgiveness is not always easy. At times, it feels more painful than the wound we suffered to forgive the one that inflicted it. And yet, there is no peace without forgiveness." We're going to be talking about that in today's episode. But first, we start every episode with a hug. And a hug is really an opportunity for us to celebrate what you're doing in your marriage, where you're being intentional, the breakthroughs that you've had. And this hug comes from a Facebook direct message we received that says, "I have been dying to message and tell you guys how much you have changed the trajectory of my marriage for the last 10 years, to say the least. Our marriage has been pretty close to what you and Tony were like. I was just about to go into coexisting because divorce wasn't an option. After spending about $4,000 on a marriage intensive to only fall back into the same cycle, I needed a podcast change and stumbled across you guys with the episode where you're having sex only because they want to. And that's where I was at. For those of you that are curious, it's episode 820. I'm only having sex because you want it." And we'll link to that in the episode notes. She goes on to say, "Long story short, I got my husband to listen. And we have been intentional since. We have had creative in-home dates, have tried sex with eyes open, have incorporated more toy play, and have had sex more than we've had in a long time. My desire for my husband has grown, and I now look forward to the next chapter with him. You guys truly saved us, and we will join you on the cruise in April, and we are so excited. You guys truly are a marriage's saving grace."
That's good. I love it. I love it. And, truly honored and blessed to have you part of the one family. And more importantly, the intention and the action you two took and are taking to have the extraordinary marriage you desire. It's an honor to be part of the journey. And yet Elisa and I know that you have to do the work, just like we have to do the work. And we can't wait to see you at the 6 Pillars or the 6 Pillars at Sea Marriage Getaway. That is going to be amazing. And if you'd like to join us, please come on out. 6-night Western Caribbean cruise doesn't get better. April 2025. Go to oneextraordinarymarriage.com/getaway.
As Tony said at the top of this episode, we're talking about forgiveness. And last week we had shared that during the month of October, we'd done a number of events that had us in Chicago, Fort Worth, and Locust Grove, Georgia.
Awesome. And every single place was awesome.
We've just still kind of been riding the high off of just that whole month of October and who we got to see and what we got to do and all of those types of things. And, Tony and I, when we're guest speakers in a church, oftentimes the pastor will have a specific topic or message that he also wants incorporated into the marriage conference, into the weekend, whatever that looks like for him. And at both churches in October, that topic, that theme revolved around the role of forgiveness in marriage, which is a big one. And I love that pastors are bringing this, they're speaking into it, and that they want to incorporate that into a marriage conference because it has far-reaching implications in every area of a marriage.
Yep, and it sits firmly within that spiritual intimacy pillar.
Absolutely.
Which, when we're speaking about the 6 pillars of intimacy, and we have a pastor who's willing to go there and talk about forgiveness or some of the tougher topics around spiritual intimacy, I mean, Elise and I are there and we're like, yes, let's do it. How do we support? How do we engage? How do we partner with you so we can have breakthrough and we can see breakthrough for the couples that are there?
100%. And one of the things about unforgiveness is that when it's allowed to run unchecked, it easily morphs into bitterness and resentment. And I can't tell you how many coaching clients I've had over the years that talk about the resentment in their marriage, that wedge, or more accurately, it's probably like the Grand Canyon between the two of you, because closeness and connection, aka intimacy, is hindered because of these debts that have not been dealt with, the debts that you're holding on to, the debts that are the unforgiveness. And, it was really special when we were at Relevant Church in Locust Grove. Pastor Carl, on the first night, had all the couples do an exercise where, they stood facing each other and shared what they needed to forgive one another for. And one of the things too that Tony and I do when we're in any church, we are participants. If the pastor is doing something, we are participants just like everybody else. We are not above that. We are part of that experience. And because Tony and I aren't perfect, big shocker.
Well, I am.
That's what I'm talking about. We also had stuff that we had to share with one another in this exercise. When we're standing across from one another, we're looking into each other's eyes and we're like, this is what I need to forgive you for. And we stood in that space. We held space for one another. We were able to listen and to address it in a very, what I loved about it was because everybody was there. There was a little bit of a control factor in terms of you have lots of people in a room.
Yes.
Right. But it was also very intimate because it was the couples looking at one another and just being in that space. It was actually a really beautiful moment. And I think one of the highlights for a lot of the couples that first night was just being in that place. And, it got us to thinking, what does forgiveness look like in a marriage? What happens when you don't forget what's happened, right? What does that start to look like for you? Because there's this whole, forgive and forget. And I will say that's about the most bogus line on the planet. We've had lots of hurts in our marriage over the years that we have forgiven one another for, but they aren't like magically erased out of our memory. Like we know they happened. They just don't hold the power anymore. There's no longer a debt associated with that, a debt of pain or of disappointment or of, negative emotions or anything like that. It has become factual, not emotional, that has happened. And Tony recently shared with me a podcast episode called Grace Forgives by Pastor Joby Martin on the Church of 1112 podcast. And Tony sharing podcasts with me, you guys, goes back probably 15 or 16 years.
Well, when I first started listening, and that was before we even started the One Extraordinary Marriage show. And so I was listening to this and knowing that we had come out of that amazing time at Relevant Church and having done that session around forgiveness, and Elise and I were talking, and this is dropping the first week of November, and this is the month that Elise and I tend to really lean into gratitude and what are we grateful for. But to get there, sometimes we got to get into the forgiveness part of this stuff. And so I happened upon this podcast from a dear friend of mine who's in the One Family, and I'm listening to it, and it's rocking me. And so I'll have the link here to the episode in the episode notes for this, because it goes much deeper than from that spiritual intimacy perspective for us as believers. And it's a wonderful, wonderful podcast. So make sure you do listen to that as well.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that I think really struck me listening to that, being in that place in Relevant Church and just having, and even at Calvary Church earlier in October, bringing these all together, is that we often, when we've been hurt, don't want to deal with the wound. We like the Band-Aid on top of it. We like, maybe we bump into it every once in a while and we get a little enraged or a little snippy or a little snarky or a little resentful, or we like that because it means we don't have to do the work to acknowledge the pain. We don't have to acknowledge where the debt is. We don't have to acknowledge that it hurts. and that we've been hurt, because it would just be easier not to, right? Like, let's sweep that sweet thing under the rug. Let's ignore it. Let's not get into this place of forgiveness. And you know what? If you're married to the person that hurt you, like, sometimes it's just easier not to have to dig into the depths of that emotional intimacy to really uncover the emotional or the relational debt that has been perpetrated on you.
Can I just say one thing here too? Unforgiveness towards your spouse, towards someone in the family, outside of the family, can also have a massive impact in your marriage. I just want to say that it's not only your spouse when we're talking about this too. We can definitely look here, because this is what we're about here at the One Extraordinary Marriage Show. And yet you may be sitting there go like, I have nothing to forgive for my spouse. We're good. And yet there may be somebody in the family, in-laws, coworkers, kids, whatever, where you haven't released that debt that pain they inflicted on you, and it's causing an issue in your marriage though. And so let's realize that unforgiveness, not just between spouses but between others, can have that impact and can begin to have cracks in our pillars of intimacy because we're holding on to stuff.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to make sure people realize that they can use this within their marriage or outside, with others.
For the purpose of the show that we're talking about marriage.
Yes, we are, but I just wanted to make sure that they understand that.
And the reason I brought it back to marriage is because last week on Instagram stories, we asked the question, is there something that you need to forgive your spouse for? And 68% of you said yes. And I just want that to sit for a second. Almost 70% of you were willing to tell us not what it was, but that you do have something to forgive your spouse for. And just think about that for a second. This might be a conversation the two of you need to have. This might be a question that you need to ask. And maybe it's something that's been avoided for a long time, because the follow-up question that we asked is, what has kept you from forgiving your spouse? And I want you to hear these answers, because I think it speaks to so many opportunities for growth in our marriage. It's been a repeated offense. My spouse has not apologized. Stubbornness. I'm still mad about it. Pride. My spouse is selfish. I can't trust my spouse. I'm scared to get hurt again. The words or actions hurt me so deeply. And I want to just reiterate the fact that forgiveness is not forgetting what the other person did. It's not giving them a blank slate. It's not saying, hey, no big deal that you did this thing, no matter how big or how small. And also, one of the things that really hit me in that podcast, Grace Forgives, was the fact that forgiveness isn't the same thing as reconciliation. Forgiveness is an individual act. Reconciliation involves action on both parties to repair the relationship. And that's a very important distinction, because I think so often when we're talking about forgiveness, we're talking about trying to get to a place of reconciliation where there's been a repair or a restoration between the relationship, when it's just like, hey, that's going to involve both of us if we're going to get there. But what does it look like for me to forgive, for me to acknowledge how I've been hurt and by whom? And to understand that there is in that hurt, in that pain, that is a debt that is owed to me, and what my emotions are surrounding all of that. And that's some not easy emotional work to do, because you have to start peeling back the layers, the scabs that maybe you've put on top of that. And I do want to say this: if you are a believer, it's also acknowledging that Christ paid a debt, a relational debt, an emotional debt that we can never ever repay. And it's something for us to think about, because it is an area where I think where so many people, especially in this day and age, want to forgive, but they're struggling to forget. And so if we don't forget, then what does it look like to step into forgiveness? And we're going to talk about that after this break.
RH, quer saber como voar no trabalho? É só usar a Flash. Com a Flash, você concentra toda a gestão de pessoas em um único lugar. Faça a admissão dos colaboradores e solicite mais de 8 categorias de benefícios. Ah, e você ainda pode fazer todo o controle de ponto. Conheça o novo onboarding integrado da Flash em flashapp.com.br.
We're back, and we're talking about how to forgive when you're struggling to forgive the emotional and relational debt that is owed to you. And the first thing I want to say is you've got to acknowledge it. So often we walk through life and we're like, I'm fine, I'm good, nothing to worry about. Just that little gigantic elephant under the rug. If we don't acknowledge it, we can't do anything about it. If Tony didn't stand across from me, a week ago and say, Elisa, this is what I need to forgive you for, I wouldn't have known, you guys. It wasn't like it was this huge, obvious, oh yeah, Elisa. And that's how I think a lot of things are in our marriage. It's the little things. Mm-hmm. Yes, we can see the big things. I'm not talking about the big things. They're out there. But the little hurts that we perpetuate on one another, we have to acknowledge them. We have to define them and start talking about that emotional debt. Do you need an apology? Do you need to see change? Do you need empathy? Because that starts to bring these pieces together. It's not just like, say you're sorry. That's what we tell our 2-year-olds. Mm-hmm. As adults, we have to start going beyond and getting to the root and saying, what is it that I actually need? And be willing to go there, right? It's also getting into this place of releasing that debt because it's about you. Forgiving another person is about you. It's never about them. That's the reconciliation piece. And that's where I think we often trip and stumble. We're like, well, they need to do something. And that's reconciliation. Mm-hmm. Forgiveness is stepping into this place of releasing them and going, you know what? And I've said this from stages every time we've talked about forgiveness. There's a passage in Luke 23, when Jesus is hanging on the cross and he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It was the cornerstone passage that launched the book for me, the devotional Call to Love. Because in that moment, I realized that's what happens in marriage. Mm-hmm. I have to release the debt because Tony doesn't know the full scale of what he does when he hurts me. In the same way that I don't know the full scale, but I can choose to let go of my part. I can choose to let go of that debt. We can look at the deeper roots of things and start to get into this place of saying, well, where do these circumstances happen? What are the boundaries that we need to put into place? Right? Do we have to have those emotional boundaries around how we're talking to one another, who we're talking to? Mm-hmm. Right? It's a beautiful thing. There was actually a couple at our 6 Pillars weekend in Fort Worth, and I had such a beautiful time talking to them. Married many, many years. And what I really valued about them is that over all these years when they've had struggles, they have been very, very selective in who they will speak to about their challenges. They're not posting it on social media. They're not doing relationship status changes. They are keeping it very much within a group of trusted advisors, trusted counselors, so that it protects their marriage in a season of repair when they're doing their individual work and when they're also doing their couple work. And I think in the day of, highly social media-ized, I don't even know if that's a word, relationships, we might all take a better page out of their playbook to say not everything needs to be blasted on social media.
Yeah, it doesn't need to be broadcast.
And when you're in this place of forgiveness, working on yourself, working on your own healing, working on what it looks like to strengthen yourself after you've been hurt. Because I mean, Tony and I have been through hurts. We have hurt one another in the 28 years that we've been married. We've had to walk down this place of forgiveness. And that's why I even said at the top of the episode, I haven't forgotten the things that have happened in our marriage. I've done the individual work, and I believe that Tony has too, to heal for it and not have those things be these dreaded weights around us. I can talk about Tony's pornography. Tony can talk about his own pornography addiction. Like, we can talk about that. And yes, those are huge hurts, breaches of trust, all kinds of things in our marriage. But because the forgiveness piece has been extended on both sides, and Tony even said this first time he said it recently, I think it was at Relevant Church, when you brought up the fact that I don't weaponize that against you. Mm-hmm. And to your knowledge, and I can't think of an instance either, where even in the early days, I chose to weaponize that.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things in this area of forgiveness is both mine and Elisa's ability to forgive and yet not use what has happened against one another when we do get into disagreements, arguments, times of frustration. And so, for instance, pornography addiction, 18-year pornography addiction. If you want to listen to it, go listen to episode 7. I share the whole story. And that led into our marriage. 7 years of our marriage was me with a pornography addiction. From the time that Elisa has forgiven me for that breach of trust, not once has she come back and said, well, I can't trust you because you used pornography all those years ago. That to me is a huge blessing and something that maybe some of you need to hear. It's like, we haven't forgotten about it. We haven't forgotten about the words that we've used against each other, but we don't come and bring it back up. We've forgiven each other. We've released it. And there are times when we got to do it again, but we don't go back to the past to dig up something that's already been buried, is dead, is done, and then use it against one another. Because that then opens up a whole nother area of unforgiveness. And we got to work through that. And so one of the things I will have to say, these become cycles. If you're getting stuck in these cycles of this is happening, like you're willing to forgive until the next time something happens and then everything comes back, there's something deep rooted in you and possibly in your spouse that's happening.
And I want to say there is a slight distinction here if we're talking, and I won't say slight, there is a distinction here if it's a repeated offense and somebody is not taking action
Correct.
to change versus they've taken the action to change and you're having a hard time letting go. Those are having
two very drastic and different scenarios.
Correct. Because if they are making steps to change, that's really where this comes into, like, what's the personal development? What's the healing that you need to do? If they are repeating the same action over and over and over again, that's where you can work on forgiveness, but you also need to have those boundaries set up.
Yep.
So that you don't keep finding yourself in that place of hurt. So those can be two different things. I just want to point that out, that we're not saying that you have to stay in destructive, toxic, abusive circumstances and keep forgiving somebody for perpetuating hurt on you.
Yes. Abuse, emotional, physical, sexual abuse is not acceptable.
Yeah.
Period. In a marriage. That is not what we are saying. If that is where you're at, please get help. What we're saying is, if you continuously have forgiven and then bringing it back up,
you might not have forgiven as much as you thought you had. There might be more individual work that needs to be done. And even as we're in November, this could be a great place to actually start to incorporate something like a gratitude plan or a gratitude journal where you can sit down and actually start to document. I mean, it's very well documented in the literature and the research and whatnot, that when we start to look for the good things, when we start to express gratitude and appreciation, we start to find more of what we're looking at. So if you've been in that place of unforgiveness, crankiness, nitpicking, blaming, whatever that might be, and you make a commitment this month to say, you know what, I'm gonna work on expressing gratitude. I'm gonna work on, keeping track of those times when I can see the positive in my spouse. Then you'll very likely, I don't want to say always, because, we did an episode called Always or Never, but you'll very likely start to see shifts because your focus has shifted and you've gotten yourself into a place where you're looking at different things and you're getting different results.
Yeah. And we have a free Gratitude Planner Marriage Guide that you can pick up at oneextraordinarymarriage.com/gratitude. And this may be that place for you to go, okay, I'm going to start with this gratitude piece so that way I can work on the unforgiveness piece so I can get to the part of forgiving my spouse. Listen, when we are dealing with forgiveness, it is one of those big areas in our marriages that can change things around like you would not believe. The ability to forgive your spouse for those things that they've done to you and towards you and vice versa can unlock your 6 pillars of intimacy. And so as we step into this latter part of the year, what is it you need to forgive your spouse for? And this is about you, not them right now. I'm talking to you. What do you need to forgive them for? And release. And then take that gratitude planner and start to write what you're grateful for in your marriage for them. And see the shift that can happen from now into the end of the year. Because as we step into 2025, let's break through. Let's have the extraordinary marriage we desire. But sometimes the work needs to start now. So go do it. Take time this week. Think about it. Where do you need to release? 68% of you need to forgive your spouse for something. So let's go at it. You guys have yourselves a fantastic week. Have a great one. We love you guys. Thank you for listening to the One Extraordinary Marriage Show. If you love this podcast, please leave a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you are listening. Your review helps others find the show and know that it's the right fit for them and their marriage.